Hello all, welcome back. So this lecture is on Zimbabwe, the Great Zimbabwe specifically. So a lot of what is covered in this lecture was briefly discussed on the podcast, which hopefully y'all had a chance to listen to. That is a Missed in History class podcast. That is the one that I've talked about several times in class and said how much I enjoy it. So hopefully y'all enjoyed it too. So just to give you a little bit of background before we start talking about the Great Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, along with Zambia, were originally called Rhodesia in the West, and this was named after Cecil Rhodes. So some of y'all might be familiar with the name. Cecil Rhodes, he founds Rhodesia, again, Zimbabwe, Zambia, in the 1870s. And he finds diamonds there in South Africa, and then he founded the De Beers mining company in 1880, and that's a very famous diamond company. So in 1889, he has a diamond monopoly, and he institutes what's known as the hut tax. So basically, if anyone was traveling within the country, or if they were out after curfew, etc., they, without the proper papers, they could be arrested and forced to work for the company for up to 5 years. So again, this should sound pretty similar to the pass laws in South Africa, if you've watched that lecture yet, and the enslavement, essentially, or indentured servitude of the Ndebele people on the Boer farms, etc. Okay, so we have a lot of this going on. Rhodes is actually most well known nowadays for the Rhodes Scholarship, which provides funds to travel the world and study other countries. It was actually initially founded in order to promote British imperialism. And Rhodesia is actually quite well known. Let me share my screen. Sorry, I forgot to open up. There we go. It's known as a white supremacist symbol. So this is Dylan Roof. He's the one who shot the Baptist church in the American South, and he's wearing the Rhodesian flag. So this is very much a dog whistle for white supremacists. So just to give you a little bit of background on Zimbabwe. So what we're going to be focusing on specifically today is the Great Zimbabwe. Now, Zimbabwe means house of stone, or it could also mean venerated house, etc. And the reason this is called the Great Zimbabwe is because of its sheer size and the amount of talent that it would have taken simply to put this together. So this picture is taken from the hill complex. And what we're looking at is the valley and the great enclosure. So should be pretty self-evident, but this is the great enclosure here. And then these are the valley ruins. As you can see, it is a massive complex. So the hill complex was likely originally the residence of the kings. We're not entirely sure of the function of the great enclosure, but it is huge. I have the dimensions. Let me grab those quickly. Okay. So this wall, this great enclosure, let me zoom in a smidge, is 800 feet long. It is 7 feet thick, and it is 32 feet tall. And all of this is built without mortar. Okay. So this is blocks that have been placed together. And because of the nature of the style of building as well as the nature of the material, it has created this flush wall. You can see how smooth it looks, okay? Extremely talented. And the way that this would have been made was that the rocks were quarried from a nearby site, and they would actually make slabs in a very interesting way. So it is granite, and what they would do was they would make fire on the exposed granite, and then they would quench it with water to cool the rock, and that causes the rock to split, and it would create these blocks. So the Great Zimbabwe has been known in the West since 1531. That is when it was first mentioned in writing by a Portuguese captain. So again, this goes back to something that was mentioned in one of the other lectures, the privileging of textual over oral histories. But again, this is when we knew about it in the West. And then it is discovered in 1871 by a German named Karl Mach. And if you listen to the podcast, he's the one who determined that this must actually be Ophir, the biblical site of King Solomon's mines. And I don't know if y'all remember why he came to that determination. It had to do with the fact that he found a small piece of wood, and it was kind of reddish and it smelled good. It was fragrant, so he smelled it, and then he was like, this piece of wood looks an awful lot like my pencil. It must be the same type of wood. And so he concluded that this must then mean that it was cedar, specifically from Lebanon, and it was built by the, oh dear, cat incoming, by the Phoenicians. Okay, and so this would have been Ophir, as I said, at the site of King Solomon's mines. So King Solomon, we've talked about briefly in this class, specifically when we talked about Ethiopia. He's the one who was well known for his wisdom. The baby cutting in half story, that's Solomon. So it's either that or the Queen of Sheba, right? These are biblical ruins. So in the 19th century, it was a well-known fact that this was a biblical site, right? This was not an African site. Like the cast metal heads that we saw from Nigeria, that required a lot of technical skill in order to make. Oh, I'm so sorry, my cat has a cold. The explorers, she's like sneezing all over me, sorry. The explorers, they felt that there was no way that this could be the product of African work, right? So it's so technically adept that it must be European. So if it wasn't Ophir, the other alternative that was proposed was that, again, roving Greeks or Phoenicians somehow came to Zimbabwe and they built this, right? And then it was taken over by Africans, right? The people who lived there. But it's not indigenous to the region. And that was the case in the 19th century. In the early 20th century, this was disproven by archaeologists who determined that this was in fact entirely consistent with African building methods, etc. So that brings me to the issue of the excavation of the Great Zimbabwe. So Richard Nicklin Hall, again mentioned in the podcast, he's a local journalist, and he launched an archaeological investigation that involved discarding anywhere from 3 to 12 feet of stratified archaeological deposits, calling it the filth of the, hang on just one moment, Anastasia. Calling it the filth of the people who lived there, right? More modern. So obviously hugely racist viewpoint, and also very detrimental to our understanding of this site. So we've talked about the importance of the surrounding artifacts for like burial goods, etc., and how when something is taken out of that context, we lose so much information. And unfortunately, he discarded so much information. And this was obviously something that was driven by racism, right? But it was also not that uncommon to have issues with poor practices in archaeology, but this was seen almost immediately as hugely problematic. And it was actually called, quote, reckless blundering worse than anything I've ever seen. So this is a side trail, but just to point out to you how common this was, this is the Minoan Palace of Knossos on the island of Crete. And you can see that there are ruins here, but then this looks very different, okay? So this is from 1600 to 1400 BCE. And in the early 20th century, it was excavated by an archaeologist who put his own interpretation onto it. So you can see that he has used modern materials combined with the ruins of the time to create essentially what he thought it would have looked like. So this is hugely problematic because it is not reversible, which is something that's really big in taking care of artifacts, etc., etc. Okay, so it's not unheard of for this to happen, but it is hugely problematic. So getting back to the Great Zimbabwe. So this is a view of the hill complex, okay? So that is where the photo that we've spent most of this class looking at was taken from. Okay, so again, this is where the kings would have lived. In the valley, there are these amphitheater. It's essentially an amphitheater, right? Amplification of the king's voice. There would have been space for religious and ceremonial practices, etc. We're not entirely sure how everything was used. This is still seen as a religious site by the Shona people in the area, and they still visit it as a sort of religious pilgrimage. This was a city, and it was actually a trading post. So archaeological excavations of this that weren't destroyed by Richard Nicklin Hall include glass beads, right? So that would probably be like Portuguese, porcelain from China, Persian gold, and Arabian coins. Okay, so you've got a lot of different global elements combined into this one place. So this was a very important trading post. So the Great Zimbabwe itself was likely built between 1100 and 1450. The site was abandoned in 1450 due to deforestation and lack of food. So between 1100 and 1450 is when most of this occurred. Okay, so you can see this is a very slightly distorted fisheye view of the great enclosure. But again, right, this is really nice because it gives you an idea of the scale. Like I said, it's 800 feet long, 32 feet high, and 7 feet thick. And this would not have been for protection. Okay, look, you can see all the different blocks. This would have been as a show of strength, right? This would have been social status, etc. But again, this was not fortification against enemies. And as I said before, but it bears reiterating, no mortar. Okay, these blocks were just fitted together so perfectly. And think about this. This is something that is not essential for safety. This is just something that people built because they could and because of what it said about them. And this is so extra. It's like 32 feet tall and 7 feet thick. That's crazy. Okay, so again, right? Think about the rock churches of Ethiopia and just all of this demonstration of skill, etc., that was not required, but they had the skills and the ability, and they put the time into doing this. So it's really an amazing, amazing feat. Okay, so this great enclosure, as it's known, is actually the largest single ancient enclosure from Africa. I believe it is visible from outer space, but I'm not positive on that. So cattle herding was also a big part of life in this area. Since the 900s, staple of economic wealth, right? They've found a vast amount of cattle bones at this site, large royal herds, etc. Okay, so This is now a UNESCO site. I think I mentioned that, and it came up in the podcast as well. An entry fee is now charged, which is seen as highly problematic by the people native to the area because this is still a religious site for them, and being charged to enter it is definitely problematic for them. So let's see, what else? So, like I said, we're not entirely sure what the function of all of these elements are. You can see here, right? This is a tower in the Great Enclosure. Oh dear. I had high hopes for my internet connection today. Okay, so it could have been a royal city, right? It's possible that the Great Enclosure is in some way tied to feminine aspects, right? So enclosed, internal, that sort of has female symbolism to it, both in the West and in Africa, but we're not sure. Okay, so these towers, they're shaped somewhat like modern granaries, but they was recently determined that they are actually solid, so they would not have been used for storing anything. And there are often an outer and an inner wall, and you can see here that this is going between the two. So we don't know what these towers would have been for. Again, this is a show of strength rather than something that was necessary for defense or protection. Okay, so just really, really look at these images. Okay, think about the work that would have gone into making this, right? So, and like the rock churches from Ethiopia, these would have been made at about the same time as the cathedrals throughout Europe, right? So, all across the world, you have these shows of devotion, right? Things that require a lot of technical skill from potentially anonymous creators, right? Massive undertakings, just huge, and the skill is just mind-blowing. Look at this. Look how thick that wall is. You can see it in the entryway here, okay? So, like I said, much of what I'm saying today was covered in the podcast, but what the podcast was not able to offer was images. And it's very important that you understand just how impressive this is. And I don't think that's something that can be conveyed solely through words. So, the last thing that I want to point out is the soapstone birds. So they found 8 of these birds in the ruins, and they surmount columns that would have been over 3 feet high. Okay, so you can see here that it's a little bit over a foot tall. It's about 15 inches. Okay, and these birds, nope, I don't have any other images. These birds are not purely birds. It's a combination of human, so anthropomorphic and zoomorphic elements. So they have human lips, they have feet with 5 toes instead of claws, okay? We don't know what kind of bird this depicts, what it was intended to be. It could be an eagle, which was seen as a messenger between ancestors and humans and the sky gods. We just don't know. There are Portuguese accounts from the 16th century that fish eagles were used as messengers between kings, etc., and would deliver decapitated heads. Again, I'm not positive how accurate these accounts are. As was mentioned in the podcast, some of the earliest mentions of the Great Zimbabwe were clearly what had been told to them rather than something that they had seen, as evidenced by discussion of the Great Enclosure as being rectangular rather than the shape of an ellipsis. Okay, so a lot that we don't know about this site, although one thing that we do definitively know is that it was created by people living in Africa from Africa. It aligns with the indigenous building traditions, the archaeological evidence, everything. So there is zero question of this actually being built by Westerners or being a biblical site of Ophir for King Solomon's mines, etc. So we don't know a lot about these birds. They clearly have some very important symbolism, which again, we don't know. The birds have actually made it onto the flag of Zimbabwe itself. So they are still seen as highly important, bearing much symbolism, much significance, but we just don't know. So hopefully this combined with the podcast has given you a better sense of what the Great Zimbabwe looks like and just the sheer scale. So thank you so much, and I will talk to you soon, and I'll see you at the meeting on Monday.